Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 4. In the night, fever, pain, fatigue, it may be the indigestion of my supper of bread and cheese, roused me at last out of a hag-rid sleep to face despair. I was a soul lost amidst desolation and shame, dishonored, evilly treated, hopeless. I raged against the God I denied, and cursed him as I lay. And it was in the nature of my fever, which was indeed only half fatigue and illness, and the rest the disorder of passionate youth, that Nettie, a strangely distorted Nettie, should come through the brief dreams that marked the exhaustion of that vigil, to dominate my misery. I was sensible, with an exaggerated distinctness, of the intensity of her physical charm for me, of her every grace and beauty. She took to herself the whole gamut of desire in me, and the whole gamut of pride. She bodily was my lost honor. It was not only loss but disgrace to lose her. She stood for life and all that was denied. She mocked me as a creature of failure and defeat. My spirit raised itself towards her, and then the bruise upon my jaw glowed with a dull heat, and I rolled in the mud again before my rivals. There were times when something near madness took me, and I gnashed my teeth and dug my nails into my hands, and ceased to curse and cry out only by reason of the insufficiency of words. And once towards dawn I got out of bed and sat by my looking-glass with my revolver loaded in my hand. I stood up at last and put it carefully in my drawer and locked it, out of reach of any gutsy impulse. After that I slept for a little while. Such nights were nothing rare and strange in that old order of the world. Never a city, never a night, the whole year round. But amidst those who slept were those who waked, plumbing the deeps of wrath and misery. Countless thousands there were so ill, so troubled, they agonized near to the very borderline of madness, each one the center of a universe darkened and lost. The next day I spent in glooming lethargy. I had intended to go to Checkshill that day, but my bruised ankle was too swollen for that to be possible. I sat indoors in the ill-lit downstairs kitchen with my foot bandaged, and mused darkly and read. My dear old mother waited on me. Her brown eyes watched me and wondered at my black silences, my frowning preoccupations. I had not told her how it was my ankle came to be bruised and my clothes muddy. She had brushed my clothes in the morning before I got up. Ah, well, mothers are not treated in that way now. That I suppose must console me. I wonder how far you will be able to picture that dark, grimy, untidy room, with its bare deal table, its tattered wall-paper, the saucepans and kettle on the narrow, cheap, but by no means economical range, the ashes under the fireplace, the rust-spotted steel fender on which my bandaged feet rested. I wonder how near you can come to seeing the scowling, pale-faced hobbledehoy I was, unshaven and collarless, in the Windsor chair, and the little, timid, dirty, devoted old woman who hovered about me with love peering out of her puckered eyelids. When she went out to buy some vegetables in the middle of the morning, she got me a halfpenny journal. It was just such a one as these upon my desk, only that the copy I read was damp from the press, and these are so dry and brittle they crack if I touch them. I have a copy of the actual issue I read that morning. It was a paper called emphatically the New Paper, but everybody bought it, and everybody called it the Yell. It was full that morning of stupendous news, and still more stupendous headlines, so stupendous that for a little while I was roused from my egotistical broodings to wider interests, for it seemed that Germany and England were on the brink of war. Of all the monstrous, irrational phenomena of the former time, war was certainly the most strikingly insane. In reality, it was probably far less mischievous than such quieter evil as, for example, the general acquiescence in the private ownership of land. But its evil consequences showed so plainly that even in those days of stifling confusion one marveled at it. On no conceivable grounds was there any sense in modern war, save for the slaughter and mangling of a multitude of people, the destruction of vast quantities of material, and the waste of innumerable units of energy. It effected nothing. The old war of savage and barbaric nations did at least change humanity. You assumed yourself to be a superior tribe in physique and discipline. You demonstrated this upon your neighbors, and if successful, you took their land and their women, and perpetuated and enlarged your superiority. The new war changed nothing but the color of maps, the design of postage stamps, and the relationship of a few accidentally conspicuous individuals. In one of the last of these international epileptic fits, for example, the English, with much dysentery and bad poetry, and a few hundred deaths in battle, conquered the South African Boers at a gross cost of about £3,000 per head. They could have bought the whole of that preposterous imitation of a nation for a tenth of that sum, and except for a few substitutions of personalities, this group of partially corrupt officials in the place of that, and so forth, the permanent change was altogether insignificant. But an excitable young man in Austria committed suicide when at length the Transvaal ceased to be a nation. Men went through the seat of that war after it was all over, and found humanity unchanged, except for a general impoverishment and the convenience of an unlimited supply of empty ration tins and barbed wire and cartridge cases, unchanged, and resuming with a slight perplexity all its old habits and misunderstandings. The nigger was still in his slum-like corral, the white in his ugly, ill-managed shanty. But we in England saw all these things, or did not see them, through the mirage of the new paper, in a light of mania. All my adolescence, from 14 to 17, went to the music of that monstrous resonating futility, the cheering, the anxieties, the songs and the waving flags, the wrongs of generous Buller, and the glorious heroism of DeWitt, who always got away. That was the great point about the heroic DeWitt, and it never occurred to us that the total population we fought against was less than half the number of those who lived cramped, ignoble lives within the compass of the four towns. But before and after that stupid conflict of stupidities, a greater antagonism was coming into being, was slowly and quietly defining itself as a thing inevitable, sinking now a little out of our attention only to resume more emphatically, now flashing into some acute definitive expression, and now percolating and pervading some new region of thought. And that was the antagonism of Germany and Great Britain. When I think of that growing proportion of readers who belong entirely to the new order, who are growing up with only the vaguest early memories of the old world, I find the greatest difficulty in writing down the unintelligible confusions that were matter of fact to their fathers. Here were we British, 41 million of people, in a state of almost indescribably aimless economic and moral muddle that we had neither the courage, the energy, nor the intelligence to improve, that most of us had hardly the courage to think about, and with our affairs hopelessly entangled with the entirely different confusions of 350 million other persons scattered about the globe. And here were the Germans over against us, 56 millions, in a state of confusion no whit better than our own, and the noisy little creatures who directed papers and wrote books and gave lectures, and generally in that time of world dementia pretended to be the national mind, were busy in both countries, with a sort of infernal unanimity, exhorting, and not only exhorting, but successfully persuading the two peoples to divert such small common store of material, moral, and intellectual energy as either possessed into the purely destructive and wasteful business of war. And I have to tell you these things even if you do not believe them, because they are vital to my story. There was not a man alive who could have told you of any real permanent benefit, of anything whatever to counterbalance the obvious waste and evil that would result from a war between England and Germany. Whether England shattered Germany, or was smashed and overwhelmed, or whatever the end might be, the thing was in fact an enormous irrational obsession. It was, in the microcosm of our nation, curiously parallel to the egotistical wrath and jealousy that swayed my individual microcosm. It measured the excess of common emotion over the common intelligence, the legacy of inordinate passion we have received from the brute from which we came. Just as I had become the slave of my own surprise and anger, and went hither and thither with a loaded revolver, seeking and intending vague fluctuating crimes, so these two nations went about the earth, hot-eared and muddle-headed, with loaded navies and armies terribly ready at hand. Only there was not even a Nettie to justify their stupidity. There was nothing but quiet imaginary thwarting on either side. And the press was the chief instrument that kept these two huge multitudes of people directed against one another. The press, those newspapers that are now so strange to us, like the empires, the nations, the trusts, and all the other great monstrous shapes of that extraordinary time, was in the nature of an unanticipated accident. It happened as weeds happen in abandoned gardens, just as all our world has happened, because there was no clear will in the world to bring about anything better. Toward the end this press was almost entirely under the direction of youngish men of that eager, rather unintelligent type that is never able to detect itself aimless, that pursues nothing with incredible pride and zeal. And if you would really understand this mad era the Comet brought to an end, you must keep in mind that every phase in the production of these queer old things was pervaded by a strong aimless energy, and happened in a concentrated rush. Let me describe to you very briefly a newspaper day. Figure first, then, a hastily erected and still more hastily designed building in a dirty, paper-littered back street of old London, and a number of shabbily dressed men coming and going in this with projectile swiftness, and within this factory companies of printers, tensely active with nimble fingers. They were always speeding up the printers, ply their typesetting machines, and cast and arrange masses of metal in a sort of kitchen inferno, above which, in a beehive of little brightly lit rooms, disheveled men sit and scribble. There is a throbbing of telephones, and a clicking of telegraph needles, a rushing of messengers, running to and fro of heated men clutching proofs and copy. Then begins a clatter roar of machinery, catching the infection, going faster and faster, and whizzing and banging. Engineers who have never had time to wash since their birth, flying about with oil cans, while paper runs off its rolls with a shudder of haste. The proprietor, you must suppose, arriving explosively on a swift motor car, leaping out before the thing is at a standstill, with letters and documents clutched in his hand, rushing in resolute to hustle, getting wonderfully in everybody's way. At the sight of him even the messenger boys who are waiting get up and scamper to and fro. Sprinkle your vision with collisions, curses, incoherencies. You imagine all the parts of this complex lunatic machine working hysterically toward a crescendo of haste and excitement as the night wears on. At last, the only things that seem to travel slowly in all those tearing, vibrating premises are the hands of the clock. Slowly things draw on toward publication, the consummation of all those stresses. Then in the small hours, into the now dark and deserted streets comes a wild whirl of carts and men. The place spurts paper at every door, bales, heaps, torrents of paper that are snatched and flung about in what looks like a free fight, and off with a rush and clatter east, west, north, and south. The interest passes outwardly The men from the little rooms are going homeward, the printers dispersing, yawning, the roaring presses slacken. The paper exists. Distribution follows manufacture, and we follow the bundles. Our vision becomes a vision of dispersal. You see those bundles hurling into stations, catching trains by a hair's breadth and speeding on their way, breaking up, smaller bundles of them hurled with a fierce accuracy out upon platforms that rush by, and then everywhere a division of these smaller bundles into still smaller bundles, into dispersing parcels, into separate papers, and the dawn happens unnoticed amidst a great running and shouting of boys, and a shoving through letter slots, openings of windows, spreading out upon bookstalls. For the space of a few hours you must figure the whole country dotted white with rustling papers, placards everywhere vociferating the hurried lie for the day, men and women in trains, men and women eating and reading, men by study fenders, people sitting up in bed, mothers and sons and daughters waiting for father to finish, a million scattered people reading headlong or feverishly ready to read. It is just as if some vehement jet had sprayed that white foam of paper over the surface of the land. And then, you know, wonderfully gone, gone utterly, vanished as foam might vanish upon the sand. Nonsense. The whole affair of a noisy paroxysm of nonsense, unreasonable excitement, witless mischief, and a waste of strength, signifying nothing. And one of those white parcels was the paper I held in my hands as I sat with a bandaged foot on the steel fender in that dark underground kitchen of my mother's, clean roused from my personal troubles by the yelp of the headlines. She sat, sleeves tucked up from her ropey arms, peeling potatoes as I read. It was like one of a flood of disease germs that have invaded a body, that paper. There I was, one corpuscle in the big amorphous body of the English community, one of 41 million such corpuscles. And for all my preoccupations, these potent headlines, this paper ferment, caught me and swung me about. And all over the country that day, millions read as I read, and came round into line with me under the same magnetic spell, came round, how did we say it, to face the foe. The Comet had been driven into obscurity overleaf. The column headed "Distinguished Scientist Says Comet Will Strike Our Earth. Does it Matter?" went unread. Germany. I usually figure this mythical, malignant creature as a corseted, stiff-mustached emperor, enhanced by heraldic black wings and a large sword, had insulted our flag. That was the message of the new paper, and the monster towered over me, threatening fresh outrages, visibly spitting upon my faultless country's colors. Someone had hoisted a British flag on the right bank of some tropical river I had never heard of before, and a drunken German officer, under ambiguous instructions, had torn it down. Then one of the convenient, abundant natives of the country, a British subject indisputably, had been shot in the leg. But the facts were by no means clear. Nothing was clear except that we were not going to stand any nonsense from Germany. Whatever had or had not happened, we meant to have an apology for, and apparently they did not mean apologizing. Has war come at last? That was the headline. One's heart leapt to assent. There were hours that day when I clean forgot Nettie in dreaming of battles and victories by land and sea, of shell fire and entrenchments and the heaped slaughter of many thousands of men. But the next morning I started for Checkshill. Started, I remember, in a curiously hopeful state of mind, oblivious of comets, strikes, and wars. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 4. Chapter 3, Sections 5 and 6. Section 5. You must understand that I had no set plan of murder when I walked over to Checkshill. I had no set plan of any sort. There was a great confusion of dramatically conceived intentions in my head, scenes of threatening and denunciation and terror. But I did not mean to kill. The revolver was to turn upon my rival my disadvantage and age and physique. But that was not it really. The revolver. I took the revolver because I had the revolver and was a foolish young lout. It was a dramatic sort of thing to take. I had, I say, no plan at all. Ever and again during the second trudge to Checkshill I was irradiated with a novel, unreasonable hope. I had awakened in the morning with the hope, it may have been the last unfaded trail of some obliterated dream, that after all Nettie might relent toward me, that her heart was kind toward me in spite of all that I imagined had happened. I even thought it was possible that I might have misinterpreted what I had seen. Perhaps she would explain everything. My revolver was in my pocket for all that. I limped at the outset, but after the second mile my ankle warmed to forgetfulness, and the rest of the way I walked well. Suppose, after all, I was wrong. I was still debating that as I came through the park. By the corner of the paddock near the keeper's cottage I was reminded by some belated blue hyacinths of a time when I and Nettie had gathered them together. It seemed impossible that we could really have parted ourselves for good and all. A wave of tenderness flowed over me and still flooded me as I came through the little dell and drew towards the hollies. But there the sweet Nettie of my boy's love faded, and I thought of the new Nettie, of desire and the man I had come upon in the moonlight. I thought of the narrow, hot purpose that had grown so strongly out of my springtime freshness, and my mood darkened to night. I crossed the beechwood and came towards the gardens with a resolute and sorrowful heart. When I reached the green door in the garden wall, I was seized for a space with so violent a trembling that I could not grip the latch to lift it, for I no longer had any doubt how this would end. The trembling was succeeded by a feeling of cold and whiteness and self-pity. I was astonished to find myself grimacing, to feel my cheeks wet, and thereupon I gave way completely to a wild passion of weeping. I must take just a little time before the thing was done. I turned away from the door and stumbled for a little distance, sobbing loudly, and lay down out of sight among the bracken, and so presently became calm again. I lay there some time. I had half a mind to desist, and then my emotion passed like the shadow of a cloud, and I walked very coolly into the gardens. Through the open door of one of the glass houses I saw old Stuart. He was leaning against the staging, his hands in his pockets, so deep in thought he gave no heed to me. I hesitated and went on towards the cottage slowly. Something struck me as unusual about the place, but I could not tell at first what it was. One of the bedroom windows was open, and the customary short blind, with its brass upper rail partly unfastened, drooped obliquely across the vacant space. It looked negligent and odd, for usually everything about the cottage was conspicuously trim. The door was standing wide open, and everything was still. But giving that usually orderly hall an odd look, it was about 2:30 in the afternoon, was a pile of 3 dirty dishes with used knives and forks upon them on one of the hall chairs. I went into the hall, looked into either room, and hesitated. Then I fell upon the door knocker and gave a loud rat-tat-too, and followed this up with an amiable "Hello." For a time no one answered me, and I stood listening and expectant, with my fingers about my weapon. Someone moved about upstairs presently, and was still again. The tension of waiting seemed to brace my nerves. I had my hand on the knocker for the second time when Puss appeared in the doorway. For a moment we remained staring at one another without speaking. Her hair was disheveled, her face dirty, tear-stained, and irregularly red. Her expression at the sight of me was pure astonishment. I thought she was about to say something, and then she had darted away out of the house again. "I say, Puss!" I said. "Puss!" I followed her out of the door. "Puss, what's the matter? Where's Nettie?" She vanished round the corner of the house. I hesitated, perplexed, whether I should pursue her. What did it all mean? Then I heard someone upstairs. "Willie!" cried the voice of Mrs. Stuart. "Is that you?" "Yes," I answered. "Where is everyone? Where's Nettie? I want to have a talk with her." She did not answer, but I heard her dress rustle as she moved. I judged she was upon the landing overhead. I paused at the foot of the stairs, expecting her to appear and come down. Suddenly came a strange sound, a rush of sounds, words jumbled and hurrying, confused and shapeless, borne along upon a note of throaty distress that at last submerged the words altogether and ended in a wail. Except that it came from a woman's throat, it was exactly the babbling sound of a weeping child with a grievance. "I can't," she said, "I can't," and that was all I could distinguish. It was to my young ears the strangest sound conceivable from a kindly, motherly little woman, whom I had always thought of chiefly as an unparalleled maker of cakes. It frightened me. I went upstairs at once in a state of infinite alarm. And there she was upon the landing, leaning forward over the top of the chest of drawers, beside her open bedroom door, and weeping. I never saw such weeping. One thick strand of black hair had escaped and hung with a spiral twist down her back. Never before had I noticed that she had gray hairs. As I came upon the landing her voice rose again. "Oh, that I should have to tell you, Willie! Oh, that I should have to tell you!" She dropped her head again, and a fresh gust of tears swept all further words away. I said nothing. I was too astonished. But I drew nearer to her and waited. I never saw such weeping. The extraordinary wetness of her dripping handkerchief abides with me to this day. "That I should have lived to see this day!" she wailed. "I'd rather 1,000 times she was struck dead at my feet." I began to understand. "Mrs. Stuart," I said, clearing my throat, "what has become of Nettie?" "That I should have lived to see this day," she said by way of reply. I waited till her passion abated. There came a lull. I forgot the weapon in my pocket. I said nothing, and suddenly she stood erect before me, wiping her swollen eyes. "Willie," she gulped, "she's gone." "Nettie?" "Gone. Run away from her home. Oh, Willie, Willie, the shame of it, the sin and shame of it!" She flung herself upon my shoulder and clung to me, and began again to wish her daughter lying dead at our feet. "There, there," said I, and all my being was a tremble. "Where has she gone?" I said as softly as I could. But for the time she was preoccupied with her own sorrow, and I had to hold her there and comfort her with the blackness of finality spreading over my soul. "Where has she gone?" I asked for the 4th time. "I don't know. We don't know. And oh, Willie, she went out yesterday morning. I said to her, 'Nettie,' I said to her, 'you're mighty fine for a morning call.' 'Fine clothes for a fine day,' she said, and that was her last words to me, Willie. The child I suckled at my breast." "Yes, yes, but where has she gone?" I said. She went on with sobs, and now telling her story with a sort of fragmentary hurry. "She went out bright and shining out of this house forever. She was smiling, Willie, as if she was glad to be going." "Glad to be going," I echoed with soundless lips. "You're mighty fine for the morning," I says, "mighty fine." "Let the girl be pretty," says her father, "while she's young. And somewhere she's got a parcel of her things hidden to pick up, and she was going off. Out of this house forever." She became quiet. "Let the girl be pretty," she repeated. "Let the girl be pretty while she's young. Oh, how can we go on living, Willie? He doesn't show it, but he's like a stricken beast. He's wounded to the heart. She was always his favorite. He never seemed to care for Puss like he did for her, and she's wounded him." "Where has she gone?" I reverted at last to that. "We don't know. She leaves her own blood. She trusts herself. Oh, Willie, it'll kill me. I wish she and me together were lying in our graves." "But," I moistened my lips and spoke slowly, "she may have gone to marry. If that was so, I prayed to God it might be so, Willie. I prayed that he'd take pity on her. Him, I mean, she's with." I jerked out. "Who's that?" "In her letter she said he was a gentleman. She did say he was a gentleman." "In her letter? Has she written? Can I see the letter?" "Her father took it." "But if she writes, when did she write?" "It came this morning." "But where did it come from? You can tell." "She didn't say. She said she was happy. She said love took one like a storm. Curse that! Where is her letter? Let me see it. And as for this gentleman—" She stared at me. "You know who it is." "Willie," she protested. "You know who it is, whether she said or not." Her eyes made a mute, unconfident denial. "Young Verrall?" She made no answer. "All I could do for you, Willie," she began presently. "Was it young Verrall?" I insisted. For a second, perhaps, we faced one another in stark understanding. Then she plumped back to the chest of drawers and her wet pocket handkerchief, and I knew she sought refuge from my relentless eyes. My pity for her vanished. She knew it was her mistress's son as well as I, and for some time she had known. She had felt. I hovered over her for a moment, sick with amazed disgust. I suddenly bethought me of old Stuart out in the greenhouse, and turned and went downstairs. As I did, I looked up to see Mrs. Stuart moving droopingly and lamely back into her own room. Section 6. Old Stuart was pitiful. I found him still inert in the greenhouse where I had first seen him. He did not move as I drew near him. He glanced at me and then stared hard again at the flower pots before him. "Ah, Willie," he said, "this is a black day for all of us." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "The missus takes on so," he said. "I came out here." "What do you mean to do?" "What is a man to do in such a case?" "Do!" I cried. "Why do?" "He ought to marry her," he said. "By God, yes!" I cried. "He must do that anyhow." "He ought to. It's cruel. But what am I to do? Suppose he won't? Likely he won't. What then?" He drooped with an intensified despair. "Here's this cottage," he said, pursuing some contracted argument. "We've lived here all our lives, you might say. Clear out at my age one can't die in a slum." I stood before him for a space, speculating what thoughts might fill the gaps between those broken words. I found his lethargy and the dimly shaped mental attitudes his words indicated abominable. I said abruptly, "You have her letter?" He dived into his breast pocket, became motionless for 10 seconds, then woke up again and produced her letter. He drew it clumsily from its envelope and handed it to me silently. "Why," he cried, looking at me for the first time, "what's come to your chin, Willie?" "It's nothing," I said. "It's a bruise." And I opened the letter. It was written on greenish tinted fancy note paper, with all and more than Nettie's usual triteness and inadequacy of expression. Her handwriting bore no traces of emotion. It was round and upright and clear as though it had been done in a writing lesson. Always her letters were like masks upon her image. They fell like curtains before the changing charm of her face. One altogether forgot the sound of her light clear voice, confronted by a perplexing stereotyped thing that had mysteriously got a hold upon one's heart and pride. How did that letter run? "My dear mother, do not be distressed at my going away. I have gone somewhere safe, and with someone who cares for me very much. I am sorry for your sakes, but it seemed that it had to be. Love is a very difficult thing, and takes hold of one in ways one does not expect. Do not think I am ashamed about this. I glory in my love, and you must not trouble too much about me. I am very, very happy." Deeply underlined. "Fondest love to father and puss. Your loving Nettie." That queer little document! I can see it now for the childish, simple thing it was, but at the time I read it in a suppressed anguish of rage. It plunged me into a pit of hopeless shame. There seemed to remain no pride for me in life until I had revenge. I stood staring at those rounded, upstanding letters, not trusting myself to speak or move. At last I stole a glance at Stuart. He held the envelope in his hand, and stared down at the postmark between his horny thumbnails. "You can't even tell where she is," he said, turning the thing round in a hopeless manner, and then desisting. "It's hard on us, Willie. Here she is. She hadn't anything to complain of. A sort of pet for all of us. Not even made to do her share of the housework. And she goes off and leaves us like a bird that's learnt to fly. Can't trust us. That's what takes me. Puts herself. But there. What's to happen to her?" "What's to happen to him?" He shook his head to show that problem was beyond him. "You'll go after her," I said in an even voice. "You'll make him marry her." "Where am I to go?" he asked helplessly, and held out the envelope with a gesture. And what could I do, even if I knew? How could I leave the gardens? "Great God!" I cried. "Not leave these gardens! It's your honor, man. If she was my daughter, I'd tear the world to pieces." I choked. "You mean to stand it?" "What can I do?" "Make him marry her. Horsewhip him, I say. I'd strangle him." He scratched slowly at his hairy cheek, opened his mouth, and shook his head. Then, with an intolerable note of sluggish gentle wisdom, he said, "People of our sort, Willie, can't do things like that." I came near to raving. I had a wild impulse to strike him in the face. Once in my boyhood I happened upon a bird terribly mangled by some cat, and killed it in a frenzy of horror and pity. I had a gust of that same emotion now, as the shameful, mutilated soul fluttered in the dust before me. Then, you know, I dismissed him from the case. "May I look?" I asked. He held out the envelope reluctantly. "There it is," he said, and pointing with his garden rough forefinger. IAPAMP. What can you make of that?" I took the thing in my hands. The adhesive stamp, customary in those days, was defaced by a circular postmark which bore the name of the office of departure and the date. The impact in this particular case had been light or made without sufficient ink, and half the letters of the name had left no impression. I could distinguish IAPAMP, and very faintly below DSO. I guessed the name in an instant flash of intuition. It was Shaphambury. The very gaps shaped that to my mind. Perhaps, in a sort of semi-visibility, other letters were there, at least hinting themselves. It was a place somewhere on the east coast, I knew, either in Norfolk or Suffolk. "Why?" I cried, and stopped. What was the good of telling him? Old Stuart glanced up sharply, I am inclined to think almost fearfully, into my face. You haven't got it?" he said. "Shaphambury. I should remember that." "You don't think you got it?" he said. I handed the envelope back to him. "For a moment I thought it might be Hampton," I said. "Hampton?" he repeated. "Hampton? How could you make Hampton?" He turned the envelope about. "Ham. Why, Willie, you're a worse hand at the job than me." He replaced the letter in the envelope and stood erect to put this back in his breast pocket. I did not mean to take any risk in this affair. I drew a stump of pencil from my waistcoat pocket, turned a little away from him, and wrote "Shaphambury" very quickly on my frayed and rather grimy shirt cuff. "Well," said I, with an air of having done nothing remarkable. I turned to him with some unimportant observation, I have forgotten what. I never finished whatever vague remark I commenced. I looked up to see a third person waiting at the greenhouse door. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Sections 5 and 6. Chapter 3, Section 7. It was old Mrs. Verrall. I wonder if I can convey the effect of her to you. She was a little old lady with extraordinarily flaxen hair. Her weak aquiline features were pursed up into an assumption of dignity, and she was richly dressed. I would like to underline that "richly dressed," or have the words printed in florid Old English or Gothic lettering. No one on earth is now quite so richly dressed as she was. No one old or young indulges in so quiet and yet so profound sumptuosity. But you must not imagine any extravagance of outline or any beauty or richness of color. The predominant colors were black and fur browns, and the effect of richness was due entirely to the extreme costliness of the material employed. She affected silk brocades with rich and elaborate patterns, priceless black lace over creamy or purple satin, intricate trimmings through which threads and bands of velvet wriggled, and in the winter rare furs. Her gloves fitted exquisitely, and her ostentatiously simple chains of fine gold and pearls, and a great number of bracelets laced about her little person. One was forced to feel that the slightest article she wore cost more than all the wardrobe of a dozen girls like Nettie. Her bonnet affected a simplicity that is beyond rubies. Richness, that is the first quality about this old lady that I would like to convey to you, and the second was cleanliness. You felt that old Mrs. Verrall was exquisitely clean. If you had boiled my poor dear old mother in soda for a month, you couldn't have gotten her so clean as Mrs. Verrall constantly and manifestly was. And pervading all her presence shone her third great quality, her manifest confidence in the respectful subordination of the world. She was pale and a little out of breath that day, but without any loss of her ultimate confidence, and it was clear to me that she had come to interview Stuart upon the outbreak of passion that had bridged the gulf between their families. And here again I find myself writing in an unknown language, so far as my younger readers are concerned. You who know only the world that followed the great change will find much that I am telling inconceivable. Upon these points I cannot appeal, as I have appealed for other confirmations, to the old newspapers. These were things that no one wrote about because everyone understood and everyone had taken up an attitude. There were in England and America, and indeed throughout the world, two great informal divisions of human beings, the secure and the insecure. There was not and never had been in either country a nobility. It was and remains a common error that the British peers were noble. Neither in law nor custom were there noble families, and we altogether lacked the edification one found in Russia, for example, of a poor nobility. A peerage was an hereditary possession that, like the family land, concerned only the eldest sons of the house. It radiated no luster of noblesse oblige. The rest of the world were in law and practice common, and all America was common. But through the private ownership of land that had resulted from neglect of feudal obligations in Britain and utter want of political foresight in the Americas, large masses of property had become artificially stable in the hands of a small minority, to whom it was necessary to mortgage all new public and private enterprises, and who were held together not by any tradition of service and nobility, but by the natural sympathy of common interests and a common large scale of living. It was a class without any very definite boundaries. Vigorous individualities, by methods for the most part violent and questionable, were constantly thrusting themselves from insecurity to security, and the sons and daughters of secure people, by marrying insecurity or by wild extravagances or flagrant vice, would sink into the life of anxiety and insufficiency which was the ordinary life of man. The rest of the population was landless, and except by working directly or indirectly for the secure, had no legal right to exist. And such was the shallowness and insufficiency of our thought, such the stifled egotism of all our feelings before the last days, that very few indeed of the secure could be found to doubt that this was the natural and only conceivable order of the world. It is the life of the insecure under the old order that I am displaying, and I hope that I am conveying something of its hopeless bitterness to you, but you must not imagine that the secure lived lives of paradisiacal happiness. The pit of insecurity below them made itself felt, even though it was not comprehended. Life about them was ugly. The sight of ugly and mean houses, of ill-dressed people, the vulgar appeals of the dealers in popular commodities were not to be escaped. There was below the threshold of their minds an uneasiness. They not only did not think clearly about social economy, but they displayed an instinctive disinclination to think. Their security was not so perfect that they had not a dread of falling toward the pit. They were always lashing themselves by new ropes. Their cultivation of connections of interest, their desire to confirm and improve their positions, was a constant ignoble preoccupation. You must read Thackeray to get the full flavor of their lives. Then the bacterium was apt to disregard class distinctions, and they were never really happy in their servants. Read their surviving books. Each generation bewails the decay of that fidelity of servants no generation ever saw. A world that is squalid in one corner is squalid altogether, but that they never understood. They believed that there was not enough of anything to go round. They believed that this was the intention of God and an incurable condition of life, and they held passionately and with a sense of right to their disproportionate share. They maintained a common intercourse as society of all who were practically secure, and their choice of that word is exhaustively eloquent of the quality of their philosophy. But if you can master these alien ideas upon which the old system rested, just in the same measure will you understand the horror these people had for marriages with the insecure. In the case of their girls and women, it was extraordinarily rare, and in the case of either sex, it was regarded as a disastrous social crime. Anything was better than that. You are probably aware of the hideous fate that was only too probably the lot during those last dark days of every girl in the insecure classes who loved and gave way to the impulse of self-abandonment without marriage, and so you will understand the peculiar situation of Nettie with young Verrall. One or the other had to suffer, and as they were both in a state of great emotional exaltation and capable of strange generosities toward each other, it was an open question and naturally a source of great anxiety to a mother in Mrs. Verrall's position whether the sufferer might not be her son, whether as the outcome of that glowing, irresponsible commerce Nettie might not return prospective mistress of Checkshill Towers. The chances were greatly against that conclusion, but such things did occur. These laws and customs sound, I know, like a record of some nasty-minded lunatic's inventions. They were invincible facts in that vanished world into which by some accident I had been born, and it was the dream of any better state of things that was scouted as lunacy. Just think of it. This girl I loved with all my soul, for whom I was ready to sacrifice my life, was not good enough to marry young Verrall, and I had only to look at his even, handsome, characterless face to perceive a creature weaker and no better than myself. She was to be his pleasure until he chose to cast her aside, and the poison of our social system had so saturated her nature. His evening dress, his freedom, and his money had seemed so fine to her, and I so clothed in squalor, that to that prospect she had consented. And to resent social conventions that created this situation was called class envy, and gently born preachers reproached us for the mildest resentment against an injustice no living man would now either endure or consent to profit by. What was the sense of saying peace when there was no peace? If there was one hope in the disorders of that old world, it lay in revolt and conflict to the death. But if you can really grasp the shameful grotesqueness of the old life, you will begin to appreciate the interpretation of old Mrs. Verrall's appearance that leapt up at once in my mind. She had come to compromise the disaster. And the Stuarts would compromise. I saw that only too well. An enormous disgust at the prospect of the imminent encounter between Stuart and his mistress made me behave in a violent and irrational way. I wanted to escape seeing that, seeing even Stuart's first gesture in that at any cost. "I'm off," said I, and turned my back on him without further farewell. My line of retreat lay by the old lady, and so I advanced toward her. I saw her expression change. Her mouth fell a little way open, her forehead wrinkled, and her eyes grew round. She found me a queer customer even at the first sight, and there was something in the manner of my advance that took away her breath. She stood at the top of the 3 or 4 steps that descended to the level of the hothouse floor. She receded a pace or two, with a certain offended dignity at the determination of my rush. I gave her no sort of salutation. Well, as a matter of fact, I did give her a sort of salutation. There is no occasion for me to begin apologizing now for the thing I said to her. I strip these things before you. If only I can get them stark enough, you will understand and forgive. I was filled with a brutal and overpowering desire to insult her. And so I addressed this poor little expensive old woman in the following terms, converting her by a violent metonymy into a comprehensive plural. "You infernal land thieves," I said point blank into her face, "have you come to offer them money?" And without waiting to test her powers of repartee, I passed rudely beyond her and vanished, striding with my fist clenched, out of her world again. I have since tried to imagine how the thing must have looked to her. So far as her particular universe went, I had not existed at all, or I had existed only as a dim black thing, an insignificant speck, far away across her park, in irrelevant, unimportant transit, until this moment when she came sedately troubled into her own secure gardens and sought for Stuart among the greenhouses. Then abruptly I flashed into being, down that green-walled, brick-floored vista, as a black-avised, ill-clad young man, who first stared and then advanced scowling toward her. Once in existence, I developed rapidly. I grew larger in perspective, and became more and more important and sinister every moment. I came up the steps with inconceivable hostility and disrespect in my bearing, towered over her, becoming for an instant at least a sort of second French Revolution, and delivered myself with the intense concentration of those wicked and incomprehensible words. Just for a second I threatened annihilation. Happily, that was my climax. And then I had gone by, and the universe was very much as it had always been, except for the wild swirl in it, and the faint sense of insecurity my episode left in its wake. The thing that never entered my head in those days was that a large portion of the rich were rich in absolutely good faith. I thought they saw things exactly as I saw them, and wickedly denied. But indeed old Mrs. Verrall was no more capable of doubting the perfection of her family's rights to dominate a wide countryside than she was of examining the 39 Articles or dealing with any of the other of the adamantine pillars upon which her universe rested in security. No doubt I startled and frightened her tremendously, but she could not understand. None of her sort of people ever did seem to understand such livid flashes of hate as ever and again lit the crowded darkness below their feet. The thing leapt out of the black for a moment and vanished, like a threatening figure by a desolate roadside, lit for a moment by one's belated carriage lamp, and then swallowed up by the night. They counted it with nightmares, and did their best to forget what was evidently as insignificant as it was disturbing. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 7. Book 1, Chapter 4, Sections 1 2 and 3. War. Section 1. From that moment when I insulted old Mrs. Verrall, I became representative. I was a man who stood for all the disinherited of the world. I had no hope of pride or pleasure left in me. I was raging rebellion against God and mankind. There were no more vague intentions swaying me this way and that. I was perfectly clear now upon what I meant to do. I would make my protest and die. I would make my protest and die. I was going to kill Nettie, Nettie who had smiled and promised and given herself to another, and who stood now for all the conceivable delightfulness, the lost imaginations of the youthful heart, the unattainable joys in life, and Verrall, who stood for all who profited by the incurable injustice of our social order. I would kill them both, and that being done, I would blow my brains out and see what vengeance followed my blank refusal to live. So indeed I was resolved. I raged monstrously, and above me, abolishing the stars, triumphant over the yellow waning moon that followed it below, the giant meteor towered up toward the zenith. "Let me only kill," I cried. "Let me only kill." So I shouted in my frenzy. I was in a fever that defied hunger and fatigue. For a long time I had prowled over the heath towards Lowchester, talking to myself, and now that night had fully come, I was tramping homeward, walking the long 17 miles without a thought of rest, and I had eaten nothing since the morning. I suppose I must count myself mad, but I can recall my ravings. There were times when I walked weeping through that brightness that was neither night nor day. There were times when I reasoned in a topsy-turvy fashion with what I called the spirit of all things. But always I spoke to that white glory in the sky. "Why am I here only to suffer ignominies?" I asked. "Why have you made me with pride that cannot be satisfied, with desires that turn and rend me? Is it a jest, this world, a joke you play on your guests? I, even I, have a better humor than that. Why not learn from me a certain decency of mercy? Why not undo? Have I ever tormented, day by day, some wretched worm, making filth for it to trail through, filth that disgusts it, starving it, bruising it, mocking it? Why should you? Your jokes are clumsy. Try some milder fun up there, do you hear? Something that doesn't hurt so infernally. You say this is your purpose with me. You are making something with me, birth pangs of a soul. Ah, how can I believe you? You forget I have eyes for other things. Let my own case go. But what of the frog beneath the cartwheel, God, and the bird the cat has torn?" After such blasphemies I would fling out a ridiculous little debating society hand. Answer me that. A week ago it had been moonlight, white and black and hard across the spaces of the park, but now the light was livid and full of the quality of haze. An extraordinarily low white mist, not 3 feet above the ground, drifted broodingly across the grass, and the trees rose ghostly out of that phantom sea. Great and shadowy and strange was the world that night. No one seemed abroad. I and my little cracked voice drifted solitary through the silent mysteries. Sometimes I argued, as I have told. Sometimes I tumbled along in moody vacuity. Sometimes my torment was vivid and acute. Abruptly, out of apathy, would come a boiling paroxysm of fury, when I thought of Nettie mocking me and laughing, and of her and Verrall clasped in one another's arms. "I will not have it so!" I screamed. "I will not have it so!" And in one of these raving fits I drew my revolver from my pocket and fired into the quiet night. 3 times I fired it. The bullets tore through the air. The startled trees told one another in diminishing echoes the thing I had done, and then, with a slow finality, the vast and patient night healed again to calm. My shots, my curses, and blasphemies, my prayers, for anon I prayed, that silence took them all. It was, how can I express it, a stifled outcry, tranquilized, lost, amid the serene assumptions, the overwhelming empire of that brightness. The noise of my shots, the impact upon things, had for the instant been enormous. Then it had passed away. I found myself standing with the revolver held up, astonished, my emotions penetrated by something I could not understand. Then I looked up over my shoulder at the great star and remained staring at it. "Who are you?" I said at last. I was like a man in a solitary desert who has suddenly heard a voice. That, too, passed. As I came over Clayton Crest I recalled that I missed the multitude that now, night after night, walked out to stare at the comet, and the little preacher in the waste beyond the hoardings who warned sinners to repent before the judgment, was not in his usual place. It was long past midnight, and every one had gone home, but I did not think of this at first, and the solitude perplexed me and left a memory behind. The gas lamps were all extinguished because of the brightness of the comet, and that too was unfamiliar. The little newsagent in the still High Street had shut up and gone to bed, but one belated board had been put out late and forgotten, and it still bore its placard. The word upon it, there was but one word upon it, in staring letters, was War. You figure that empty mean street, emptily echoing my footsteps, no soul awake and audible but me. Then my halt at the placard, and amidst that sleeping stillness, smeared hastily upon the board, a little askew and crumpled, but quite distinct beneath that cool meteoric glare, preposterous and appalling, the measureless evil of that word, War. Section 2. I awoke in that state of equanimity that so often follows an emotional drenching. It was late, and my mother was beside my bed. She had some breakfast for me on a battered tray. "Don't get up yet, dear," she said. "You've been sleeping. It was 3 o'clock when you got home last night. You must have been tired out." "Your poor face," she went on, "was as white as a sheet, and your eyes shining. It frightened me to let you in, and you stumbled on the stairs." My eyes went quietly to my coat pocket, where something still bulged. She probably had not noticed. "I went to Checkshill," I said. "You know, perhaps. I got a letter last evening," and as she bent near me to put the tray upon my knees, she kissed my hair softly. For a moment we both remained still, resting on that, her cheek just touching my head. I took the tray from her to end the pause. "Don't touch my clothes, Mummy," I said sharply, as she moved towards them. "I'm still equal to a clothes brush." And then, as she turned away, I astonished her by saying, "You dear mother, you! A little I understand. Only, now, dear mother, oh, let me be, let me be." And with the docility of a good servant she went from me. Dear heart of submission that the world and I had used so ill! It seemed to me that morning that I could never give way to a gust of passion again. A sorrowful firmness of the mind possessed me. My purpose seemed now as inflexible as iron. There was neither love nor hate nor fear left in me. Only I pitied my mother greatly for all that was still to come. I ate my breakfast slowly, and thought where I could find out about Shaphambury, and how I might hope to get there. I had not 5 shillings in the world. I dressed methodically, choosing the least frayed of my collars, and shaving much more carefully than was my wont. Then I went down to the public library to consult a map. Shaphambury was on the coast of Essex, a long and complicated journey from Clayton. I went to the railway station and made some memoranda from the timetables. The porters I asked were not very clear about Shaphambury, but the booking office clerk was helpful, and we puzzled out all I wanted to know. Then I came out into the coaly street again. At the least I ought to have £2. I went back to the public library and into the newspaper room to think over this problem. A fact intruded itself upon me. People seemed in an altogether exceptional stir about the morning journals. There was something unusual in the air of the room, more people and more talking than usual, and for a moment I was puzzled. Then I bethought me. "'Tis war with Germany, of course. A naval battle was supposed to be in progress in the North Sea. Let them. I returned to the consideration of my own affairs. Parload? Could I go and make it up with him and then borrow? I weighed the chances of that. Then I thought of selling or pawning something, but that seemed difficult. My winter overcoat had not cost £1 when it was new. My watch was not likely to fetch many shillings. Still, both these things might be factors. I thought with a certain repugnance of the little store my mother was probably making for the rent. She was very secretive about that, and it was locked in an old tea caddy in her bedroom. I knew it would be almost impossible to get any of that money from her willingly, and though I told myself that in this issue of passion and death no detail mattered, I could not get rid of tormenting scruples whenever I thought of that tea caddy. Was there no other course? Perhaps after every other source had been tapped, I might supplement with a few shillings frankly begged from her. These others, I said to myself, thinking without passion for once of the sons of the secure, would find it difficult to run their romances on a pawnshop basis. However, we must manage it. I felt the day was passing on, but I did not get excited about that. Slow is swiftest, Parload used to say, and I meant to get everything thought out completely, to take a long aim, and then to act as a bullet flies. I hesitated at a pawnshop on my way home to my midday meal, but I determined not to pledge my watch until I could bring my overcoat also. I ate silently, revolving plans. Section 3. After our midday dinner, it was a potato pie, mostly potato with some scraps of cabbage and bacon, I put on my overcoat and got it out of the house while my mother was in the scullery at the back. A scullery in the old world was, in the case of such houses as ours, a damp, unsavory, mainly subterranean region behind the dark living-room kitchen that was rendered more than typically dirty in our case by the fact that into it the coal cellar, a yawning pit of black uncleanliness, opened and diffused small crunchable particles about the uneven brick floor. It was a region of washing up, that greasy, damp function that followed every meal. Its atmosphere had ever a cooling steaminess, and the memory of boiled cabbage and the sooty black stains where saucepan or kettle had been put down for a minute, scraps of potato peel caught by the strainer of the escape pipe, and rags of a quite indescribable horribleness of acquisition called dishclouts rise in my memory at the name. The altar of this place was the sink, a tank of stone, revolting to a refined touch, grease-filmed and unpleasant to see, and above this was a tap for cold water, so arranged that when the water descended it splashed and wetted whoever had turned it on. The tap was our water supply, and in such a place you must fancy a little old woman, rather incompetent and very gentle, a soul of unselfishness and sacrifice, in dirty clothes, all come from their original colors to a common dusty dark gray, in worn, ill-fitting boots, with hands distorted by ill use, and untidy graying hair. My mother. In the winter her hands would be chapped, and she would have a cough, and while she washes up I go out to sell my overcoat and watch, in order that I may desert her. I gave way to a queer hesitation in pawning my 2 negotiable articles, a weekly indisposition to pawn in Clayton, where the pawnbroker knew me, carried me to the door of the place in Lynch Street, Swathinglea, where I had bought my revolver. Then came an idea that I was giving too many facts about myself to one man, and I came back to Clayton after all. I forgot how much money I got, but I remember that it was rather less than the sum I had made out to be the single fare to Shaphambury. Still deliberate, I went back to the public library to find out whether it was possible by walking for 10 or 12 miles anywhere to shorten the journey. My boots were in a dreadful state. The sole of the left one also was now peeling off, and I could not help perceiving that all my plans might be wrecked if at this crisis I went on shoe leather in which I could only shuffle. So long as I went softly they would serve, but not for hard walking. I went to the shoemaker in Hacker Street, but he would not promise any repairs for me under 48 hours. I got back home about 5 minutes to 3, resolved to start by the 5 train for Birmingham in any case, but still dissatisfied about my money. I thought of pawning a book or something of that sort, but I could think of nothing of obvious value in the house. My mother's silver, 2 gravy spoons, and a salt cellar had been pawned for some weeks, since, in fact, the June quarter day, but my mind was full of hypothetical opportunities. As I came up the steps to our door, I remarked that Mr. Gabbitas looked at me suddenly round his dull red curtains with a sort of alarmed resolution in his eye and vanished. And as I walked along the passage he opened his door upon me suddenly and intercepted me. You are figuring me, I hope, as a dark and sullen lout in shabby, cheap, old-world clothes that are shiny at all the wearing surfaces, and with a discolored red tie and frayed linen. My left hand keeps in my pocket, as though there is something it prefers to keep a grip upon there. Mr. Gabbitas was shorter than I, and the first note he struck in the impression he made upon anyone was of something bright and bird-like. I think he wanted to be bird-like. He possessed the possibility of an avian charm, but as a matter of fact there was nothing of the glowing vitality of the bird in his being. And a bird is never out of breath and with an open mouth. He was in the clerical dress of that time, that costume that seems now almost the strangest of all our old world clothing, and he presented it in its cheapest form. Black, of a poor texture, ill-fitting, strangely cut, its long skirts accentuated the tubbiness of his body, the shortness of his legs. The white tie below his all-round collar, beneath his innocent, large, spectacled face, was a little grubby, and between his not very clean teeth he held a briar pipe. His complexion was whitish, and although he was only 33 or 4 perhaps, his sandy hair was already thinning from the top of his head. To your eye now he would seem the strangest figure in the utter disregard of all physical beauty or dignity about him. You would find him extraordinarily odd, but in the old days he met not only with acceptance but respect. He was alive until within a year or so ago, but his later appearance changed. As I saw him that afternoon, he was a very slovenly, ungainly little human being indeed. Not only was his clothing altogether ugly and queer, but had you stripped the man stark, you would certainly have seen in the bulging paunch that comes from flabby muscle and flabbily controlled appetites, and in the rounded shoulders and flawed and yellowish skin, the same failure of any effort toward clean beauty. You had an instinctive sense that so he had been from the beginning. You felt he was not only drifting through life, eating what came in his way, believing what came in his way, doing without any vigor what came in his way, but that into life also he had drifted. You could not believe him the child of pride and high resolve, or any splendid passion of love. He had just happened. But we all happened then. Why am I taking this tone over this poor little curate in particular? "Hello," he said with an assumption of friendly ease. "Haven't seen you for weeks. Come in and have a gossip." An invitation from the drawing-room lodger was in the nature of a command. I would have liked very greatly to have refused it. Never was invitation more inopportune. But I had not the wit to think of an excuse. "All right," I said awkwardly, and he held the door open for me. "I'd be very glad if you would," he amplified. "One doesn't get much opportunity of intelligent talk in this parish." What the devil was he up to, was my secret preoccupation. He fussed about me with a nervous hospitality, talking in jumpy fragments, rubbing his hands together, and taking peeps at me over and round his glasses. As I sat down in his leather-covered armchair, I had an odd memory of the one in the Clayton dentist's operating room. I know not why. "They're going to give us trouble in the North Sea, it seems," he remarked, with a sort of innocent zest. "I'm glad they mean fighting." There was an air of culture about this room that always cowed me, and that made me constrained even on this occasion. The table under the window was littered with photographic material and the later albums of his Continental souvenirs, and on the American cloth-trimmed shelves that filled the recesses on either side of the fireplace were what I used to think in those days a quite incredible number of books, perhaps 800 altogether, including the reverend gentleman's photograph albums and college and school textbooks. This suggestion of learning was enforced by the little wooden shield bearing a college coat of arms that hung over the looking-glass, and by a photograph of Mr. Gabbitas in cap and gown in an Oxford frame that adorned the opposite wall. And in the middle of that wall stood his writing desk, which I knew to have pigeonholes when it was open, and which made him seem not merely cultured but literary. At that he wrote sermons, composing them himself. "Yes," he said, taking possession of the hearthrug, "the war had to come sooner or later. If we smash their fleet for them now, well, there's an end to the matter." He stood on his toes and then bumped down on his heels, and looked blandly through his spectacles at a water-color by his sister. The subject was a bunch of violets above the sideboard which was his pantry and tea-chest and cellar. "Yes," he said as he did so. I coughed and wondered how I might presently get away. He invited me to smoke, that queer old practice, and then, when I declined, began talking in a confidential tone of this dreadful business of the strikes. "The war won't improve that outlook," he said, and was very grave for a moment. He spoke of the want of thought for the wives and children shown by the colliers in striking merely for the sake of the Union, and this stirred me to controversy and distracted me a little from my resolution to escape. "I don't quite agree with that," I said, clearing my throat. "If the men didn't strike for the Union now, if they let that be broken up, where would they be when the pinch of reductions did come?" To which he replied that they couldn't expect to get top-price wages when the masters were selling bottom-price coal. I replied, "That isn't it. The masters don't treat them fairly. They have to protect themselves." To which Mr. Gabbitas answered, "Well, I don't know. I've been in the Four Towns some time, and I must say I don't think the balance of injustice falls on the master's side." "It falls on the men," I agreed, willfully misunderstanding him. And so we worked our way toward an argument. Confound this argument, I thought, but I had no skill in self-extraction, and my irritation crept into my voice. 3 little spots of color came into the cheeks and nose of Mr. Gabbitas, but his voice showed nothing of his ruffled temper. "You see," I said, "I'm a socialist. I don't think this world was made for a small minority to dance on the faces of everyone else." "My dear fellow," said the Reverend Gabbitas, "I'm a socialist too. Who isn't? But that doesn't lead me to class hatred." "You haven't felt the heel of this confounded system. I have." "Ah," said he, and catching him on that note came a rap at the front door, and as he hung suspended, the sound of my mother letting someone in and a timid rap. "Now," thought I, and stood up resolutely, but he would not let me. "No, no, no," said he. "It's only for the Dorcas money." He put his hand against my chest with an effect of physical compulsion, and cried, "Come in." "Our talk's just getting interesting," he protested, and there entered Miss Ramell, an elderly little young lady who was mighty in church help in Clayton. He greeted her. She took no notice of me, and went to his bureau, and I remained standing by my chair, but unable to get out of the room. "I'm not interrupting?" asked Miss Ramell. "Not in the least," he said, and drew out the carriers and opened his desk. I could not help seeing what he did. I was so fretted by my impotence to leave him that at the moment it did not connect at all with the research of the morning that he was taking out money. I listened sullenly to his talk with Miss Ramell, and saw only, as they say in Wales, with the front of my eyes, the small flat drawer that had, it seemed, quite a number of sovereigns scattered over its floor. "They're so unreasonable," complained Mrs. Ramell. Who could be otherwise in a social organization that bordered on insanity? I turned away from them, put my foot on the fender, stuck my elbow on the plush fringed mantelboard, and studied the photographs, pipes, and ashtrays that adorned it. What was it I had to think out before I went to the station? Of course, my mind made a queer little reluctant leap. It felt like being forced to leap over a bottomless chasm, and alighted upon the sovereigns that were just disappearing again as Mr. Gabbitas shut his drawer. "I won't interrupt your talk further," said Miss Ramell, receding doorward. Mr. Gabbitas played round her politely and opened the door for her and conducted her into the passage, and for a moment or so I had the fullest sense of proximity to those, it seemed to me there must be 10 or 12, sovereigns. The front door closed and he returned. My chance of escape had gone. End of Book 1, Chapter 4, Sections 1, 2, and 3.